The year is 2009. Midway is on the edge of bankruptcy, but only one game can save the company. Mortal Kombat vs. DC. What will happen? Yeah, in case you didn't know, this was actually the game to bankrupt the entire Midway team and shift the development of all the Mortal Kombat games over to a new team at NetherRealm Studios. Thankfully, most of the team, including the creator Ed Boon, were able to stay on and continue to work on great games in the future. But why was this game the one to wreck the franchise? Why don't we take a look at it today and see if the hate is warranted for this game or not? Join me as we explore the weird and wild world of Mortal Kombat vs. DC. Now, this is not a very beloved game in the franchise. There are tons of problems with it, and most of it comes down to the teen rating, but I'll talk more about that later. The first thing we have to start off with is the roster. There's an even split of 11 Mortal Kombat fighters and 11 DC characters. But what's interesting is that this game was released in 2009. Many of the most well-known movies that DC has ever come out with, like Batman vs. Superman or The Joker or things like that, haven't been released, though the DC roster looks far different than you would expect. But let's start with the Mortal Kombat characters. For the Mortal Kombat characters, we have Scorpion, Sub-Zero, Sonya, Shang Tsung, Kitana, Baraka, Kano, Raiden, Liu Kang, Jax, and Shao Kahn. Overall, pretty decent. There was DLC planned for this game that would have included Quan Chi and Kung Lao from the Mortal Kombat universe, which you can actually find proof of because Quan Chi is seen throughout the story mode and has a fully complete model. So really, it would have been easy for them to just drop it in. But because of the poor sales that the game had, he was never put in. On the DC side, we have Batman, Superman, The Flash, Catwoman, Joker, Wonder Woman, Deathstroke, Lex Luthor, Green Lantern, Captain Marvel, and Darkseid. And in case you didn't hear me, yes, I did say Captain Marvel, because actually, until the mid-2010s or so, Shazam was never actually known as Shazam. There was a large rights issue between him and Marvel's Captain Marvel. And while this wasn't settled until the late 2010s, it means that in this game, Shazam is still known as Captain Marvel, which is probably one of the most interesting things about this game. There was also Harley Quinn and Doomsday, of all people, planned for the DC side of the roster. Overall, the roster is solid. I think it definitely could be improved. For the Mortal Kombat side, I think that Ermac and especially Johnny Cage definitely should have been in. Johnny Cage is the only one of the original 7 fighters to not be included in this game, which is very strange. And for the DC side, I really don't know how popular people were in 2009 to be able to be counted in this game. I think the biggest outliers in this so far, as I can tell, would be like Aquaman, Robin, and maybe Cyborg. And maybe a few more Batman villains. But overall, I think it's pretty solid. But just like any game, the most important part, aside from the roster, is the combat. And personally, out of the 4 3D Mortal Kombat games, meaning that you can rotate yourself within the stage instead of just being locked to a 2D plane, I think this is the best one. The first 3 3D Mortal Kombat games, those being Deadly Alliance, Deception, and Armageddon, all had this weird mechanic where you could change your stance and weapon. While this is an interesting concept that I'd like them to try to get at some point, it makes a lot of characters far more complicated than they really need to be. On top of that, they put far more emphasis on the normal punches and kicks than the actual special moves that make the character so special. But in this game, everyone has one moveset and no way of changing their stance. In some ways, this could be cutting back, you would say, but I think particularly for the DC characters and showing off their powers, it was a good choice to do this. And now for the verse of the day. Psalms 46 verse 1 says, God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. The overall speed and the way that you fight in this game is very good, and I definitely prefer it over the other three Mortal Kombat games that were 3D based. Although there are some new changes in this that most of the community did not like at the time. The first was this kind of animation where you grab the character and had to compete in a mini game. Here, you had to press a button, and if the opponent did not press the same button, you would get hit. You could do this up to 4 times until the combo is broken. I don't think this is terrible, but it just slows down the pace of the game far too much. This also happens with the other 2 mini games that you can do. The stage transitions of falling off a cliff or running through a wall. The one over the cliff is probably better just because it takes more skill, whereas the other, that is similar to the grab one, but if you reach a certain threshold, you can press one of the buttons to cash out all your damage at once instead of giving your opponent a chance to turn the tide on you within the minigame. But the one where you run your opponent through the wall is definitely the worst one. This is a replacement of the Test Your Might minigame from the older titles. Here, all you have to do is mash the buttons as fast as possible to change how much damage is done to you or to the opponent. Personally, I think it's pretty annoying. Really, these aren't terrible ideas. The problem is just there's so many times that you can activate these things without even trying to. And this effectively breaks your combo immediately. On top of that, when you play some of the more difficult CPUs in the game, there are so many times where they read exactly which button you're going to press in the mini games that's almost impossible to win against. So as far as the normal combat goes, I think it's very good. As far as the entirety of the fighting, I think it's good enough. It could be improved, but I'm not complaining too much. The next thing to talk about are the modes. This is interesting because while it doesn't have any wacky and crazy modes, it really sticks to more of the traditional modes that you would expect in a fighting game. They are still pretty good for what they are. You have your arcade ladder where you fight a series of fights to get to the end and fight the boss. After doing so, you get a character ending. It's just a little ending to show what they did with basically Ultimate Power if they had won. It is a little bit interesting because you have the choice on whether you want to fight only Mortal Kombat, only DC, or a mix of both in the ladder. The next is the story mode, and interestingly enough, this is one of the best parts of the game because this was one of the first fully animated and fully voiced story modes in any fighting game before. Most of the time, you would only get small bits of information about that world or what the heck is going on through tower endings in games like Marvel vs. Capcom 2. The story here is that both Darkseid and Shao Kahn are defeated in the same way at the same time, and somehow that causes a rift in the universes and causes them to collide. It also makes Darkseid and Shao Kahn collide into Dark Kahn. Personally, I think this is a pretty cool design. I just think that the name could have been a little bit better. Aside from that, by today's standards, the story mode is pretty normal. You actually play it 2 ways if you want to get all the characters, because if you play it on the DC side, you get Darkseid. If you play it on the Mortal Kombat side, you get Shao Kahn. And really, that's about it. There is a combo challenge, which can be cool, but after the first couple challenges out of 10, it gets brutally difficult. But I want to talk about why this game is so hated more than anything else, and that is the teen rating. Again, this is back in 2009. So Marvel was barely getting started with their cinematic universe, and DC wasn't even trying yet. So DC was still seen as mostly a lighthearted company overall. Much darker movies like Man of Steel, The Joker, or Zack Snyder's Justice League weren't released yet, so the idea of a much darker universe wasn't really a thing yet. So the very dark and apocalyptic world of Mortal Kombat didn't clash very well at the time with the more normalized DC universe. So because of that, they couldn't include the normal Mortal Kombat fatalities and high amounts of blood and gore in this one. So while there is still blood and a few scratches on the characters within the match, it's heavily toned down from older games and definitely games to come. On top of this, the fatalities and what the game calls heroic brutalities for some of the DC characters are much, much more tamed compared to older ones that the Mortal Kombat characters are used to. The most infamous of these is Kano's, which honestly should just be a normal move.
Kano wins. Flawless victory.
Now, I'm going to say something a little bit controversial here, and so personally, I think this is a good thing. I think it's a good entry-level game for someone who's just getting into Mortal Kombat or is not old enough to play it. While you still have some of the violence in the game, it is definitely heavily toned down, but I think that helps it because you're reaching a much broader audience with this, and you're still getting to know these characters. For the most part, outside of the 3 guest characters in Injustice 1 and 2, I hadn't heard of most of these other Mortal Kombat characters before I played this game. So when I went to play Mortal Kombat 11, which was my first real Mortal Kombat game, I knew who a lot of them were. I had an actual attachment to them. So while a lot of people would just say, you are taking everything great about Mortal Kombat out, I personally don't agree. You still have their big personalities, you still have great, crazy combos, and you still have fun, enjoyable gameplay. It's just placed into a different setting. I think most of the hate also comes from the fact that, at the time, Midway was teasing one of the darkest Mortal Kombat games they had ever made, because this was the first game that they introduced onto HD systems with the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. So the fans wanted to take the updated graphics and make a far more detailed game than they could have gotten before. What they got was not only not what they were promised, but basically the exact opposite. Instead of the darkest Mortal Kombat yet, they got basically the lightest Mortal Kombat yet. So I can understand why some fans were stabbed in the back by this. So personally, I think most of the hate just comes from circumstances than this game actually being bad. And while we're on the topic of the rating, I do want to touch on the family friendliness of this. And I think it's pretty decent. Like I said, the blood is heavily toned down and it doesn't even list the fatalities in your move. So you'd have to go out of your way and look it up just to be able to try any of them. There are small bits of blood and your characters get some scratches on them. So I think it's not nearly as bad as it could be. And as an entry-level Mortal Kombat game, I think it's a fair amount. As far as the language goes, it's not really much of an issue either. There's some light cursing in the story mode, but outside of that, the characters don't have much actual dialogue. The intros and outros weren't really a thing in that time. The only other thing I do want to mention is how some of the women are dressed. There's only 4 in this game, with Wonder Woman, Catwoman, Katana, and Sonya. Katana looks pretty fine, not much issue there. Sonya's stomach is showing, so do with that what you will, I guess. Wonder Woman looks pretty fine. Could have longer pants on, but otherwise it's fine. And Catwoman is probably the worst, although she is mostly fully covered, so I guess do with this information as you will. So I think the rating of teen, which is usually about 13 and up, is pretty fair for it. Overall, in my opinion, Mortal Kombat vs. DC, taken on its own, is a very good game. It's not incredible, and I think if they tried this concept again, especially with how DC is taken as much more of a darker, grittier universe now, I think that they could make this far closer to what Mortal Kombat normally is and keep the M for mature rating. But on its own, I still think it's fantastic. I give it 8 out of 10. So those are my thoughts. What do you think? Are you going to go play this game now or not? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time.